August 25, 1944, somewhere on a dust-choked road between Normandy and Paris. Sergeant James Red Williams sat behind the wheel of a 2.5-ton truck that was older than most of the soldiers riding in the convoy behind him. The engine rattled like a dying man's breath. The brakes were soft. The tires were so worn that he could see the canvas threads beneath the rubber. And in the back of his truck sat 6,000 pounds of artillery shells destined for General George Patton's Third Army, which was tearing across France so fast that the German Wehrmacht couldn't figure out where he would strike next. Red had been driving for 36 hours straight. His eyes burned. His hands cramped on the steering wheel. He had eaten nothing but cold rations and coffee so thick it could strip paint. And he was one of 6,000 men doing the exact same thing, all of them part of an operation that German generals said was impossible. They called it the Red Ball Express, and it was the most audacious logistics operation in military history. No sleep, no rest. Just drive. Drive until the wheels fall off. Drive until you collapse. Drive until Patton runs out of gas or the war ends, whichever comes first. The Germans thought American logistics were a joke. They laughed at the idea of supplying an entire army racing across France. But Red Williams and 5,999 other men, most of them black soldiers from segregated units that the army didn't trust with rifles, proved that wars are not won by the soldiers who fire guns. Wars are won by the men who deliver the bullets. This is the story they don't teach you in history class. The story of how a convoy of broken-down trucks driven by exhausted men accomplished what every military expert said could not be done. Stay with me, because what these drivers achieved changed not just World War II, but the entire science of modern warfare. Normandy, France, June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 156,000 Allied troops stormed 5 beaches along the Norman coast, supported by 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. It was a masterpiece of planning, coordination, and raw courage. Within 24 hours, Allied forces had secured a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe. Within a week, they had pushed inland. Within a month, they had liberated the port city of Cherbourg and established a beachhead 50 miles deep. The invasion was succeeding beyond even the most optimistic projections. But there was a problem so fundamental, so potentially catastrophic, that it threatened to undo everything the Allies had fought for. Supplies, or more accurately, the complete and total lack of an effective way to move supplies from the beaches to the front lines. See, the Allied planners had anticipated needing to supply their armies as they advanced across France. They had calculated tonnage requirements, fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure. They knew that an army of 1 million men advancing hundreds of miles would need thousands of tons of supplies every single day. Food, water, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, everything an army needs to function. The plan had been to capture French ports quickly, repair them, and use them as supply hubs. Ships would arrive from England loaded with supplies. Those supplies would be unloaded, sorted, and transported by truck and rail to forward depots. From there, smaller trucks would distribute supplies to individual units. It was a sound plan on paper. But war has a way of making even the best plans obsolete. The Germans, knowing they would lose the French ports eventually, had destroyed them before retreating. Cherbourg's harbor was so thoroughly demolished that it would take months to make it operational. Other ports along the coast were either still in German hands or had been similarly destroyed. The only way to supply the armies in France was from the Normandy beaches themselves, using temporary harbors called mulberries that had been towed across the English Channel and assembled offshore. But even this system had limitations. The mulberries could only handle so much tonnage. Trucks had to drive down onto the beaches at low tide, load up, and then drive back up steep sandy inclines that chewed up tires and destroyed transmissions. It was slow, inefficient, and brutally hard on vehicles. Meanwhile, General George S. Patton's Third Army was advancing so rapidly that it outran every logistical calculation. Patton was a force of nature, a general who believed that speed and aggression were the ultimate weapons. While other Allied commanders consolidated positions and advanced cautiously, Patton pushed forward relentlessly. His tanks moved so fast that German units didn't realize they were surrounded until American flags appeared in their rear areas. His infantry bypassed strong points and kept moving, leaving them for follow-up units to deal with. It was brilliant, audacious, and completely unsustainable from a logistics standpoint. Patton's Third Army was consuming 500,000 gallons of gasoline per day. That is not a typo. 500,000 gallons, every single day. And that was just fuel. They also needed ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, spare parts, and 1,000 other items that modern armies require. All of it had to be trucked from the Normandy beaches, a distance that was growing longer by the day as Patton raced eastward. By late August 1944, Patton's army had advanced almost 400 miles from the beaches. His tanks were within striking distance of the German border. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. The war in Europe appeared to be entering its final phase, and then Patton ran out of gas, literally. His tanks ground to a halt not because of German resistance, but because there was no fuel to put in them. The supply lines had stretched beyond their breaking point. Trucks that had been designed to drive a few dozen miles per day were being run around the clock. They broke down. Tires blew out, engines seized, drivers fell asleep at the wheel and crashed. The entire logistical system was collapsing. Patton was furious. He demanded more supplies. He threatened. He cajoled. He offered to trade metals for gasoline. But there simply weren't enough trucks and drivers to keep his army moving, or at least that was what everyone thought. Enter General John C. H. Lee, commander of the Communications Zone, the organization responsible for all logistics in the European theater. Lee was not a combat general. He had never led troops in battle, but he understood supply chains, he understood transportation, and he understood that if Patton's advance stalled, the Germans would have time to regroup, reinforce, and dig in. The war that could end in 1944 would drag on into 1945 or beyond. Lee proposed something radical. He wanted to create a dedicated express trucking operation that would run non-stop from the Normandy beaches to forward supply depots near the front lines. The trucks would drive around the clock following a loop route marked with red balls. Every red ball was painted on signs, telephone poles, buildings so that even exhausted drivers could follow the route without getting lost. Every truck would be loaded to maximum capacity. There would be no speed limits, no rest stops beyond what was absolutely necessary to refuel and perform basic maintenance. Drivers would work in shifts, sleeping in their trucks between runs. The operation would continue until either Patton reached the German border or the traditional supply lines were repaired and made operational. It was a crazy idea. Military logistics officers said it would never work. Trucks were already breaking down at an alarming rate. Pushing them even harder would only accelerate the mechanical failures. Drivers were already exhausted. Denying them proper rest would lead to accidents. The entire plan violated every principle of sustainable operations. But Lee had one advantage that made his plan feasible. He had thousands of black soldiers assigned to transportation and supply units. These men had been drafted like everyone else. They had trained like everyone else. Many had volunteered for combat duty, but the United States military in 1944 was still segregated. Black soldiers were not allowed to serve in most combat units. Instead, they were assigned to support roles: quartermaster companies, transportation battalions, engineering units, the very jobs that, in the racist logic of the time, were considered less important than actual fighting. Lee saw an opportunity. These segregated units were underutilized. Many of them were sitting in England or on the beaches waiting for assignment. They had the training. They had the discipline. They had the motivation to prove themselves. And, most importantly, they had nothing to lose. The white military establishment already considered them inferior. If Lee's plan failed, it would be blamed on the impossible logistics situation, not on the men themselves. But if it succeeded, if these black soldiers could accomplish what every expert said was impossible, it would be a victory not just for the war effort, but for every person who had been told they were not good enough. Sergeant James Williams was 23 years old, from Birmingham, Alabama, and he had been in the Army for 2 years without ever seeing combat. He had tried to volunteer for infantry. He had tried to transfer to the paratroopers. He had even tried to join a tank crew. Every request had been denied. "You're in transportation. The Army needs drivers. That is where you will serve." So Red, the nickname came from his reddish-brown skin tone and had stuck since childhood, became a driver. He learned to operate every truck in the Army's inventory. He learned to perform field repairs with nothing but a wrench and duct tape. He learned to drive in the dark, in the rain, on roads that were barely more than mud tracks. He became one of the best drivers in his unit, and he resented every moment of it. Not because he didn't take pride in his work. Red took pride in everything he did, but because he wanted to fight. He wanted to prove that black soldiers could do more than drive trucks and load supplies. He wanted to storm beaches and capture towns and earn medals for valor, not for showing up on time with a load of canned rations. When the call came for volunteers to join the Red Ball Express, Red didn't hesitate. He didn't fully understand what he was volunteering for. The briefing had been vague: long hours, dangerous conditions, critical mission. That was all they were told. But it didn't matter. It was a chance to contribute to the war effort in a meaningful way, a chance to be part of something important. So he raised his hand, along with almost every other man in his unit. The first convoy of the Red Ball Express departed from Normandy on August 25, 1944. 132 trucks, each loaded with supplies. The route was simple in theory: drive from the beaches to a depot near Chartres, a distance of about 200 miles. Unload. Load up with whatever return cargo needed to go back to the beaches, usually damaged equipment or wounded soldiers. Drive back. Repeat. In practice, it was hell. The roads through Normandy were narrow, winding, and clogged with military traffic. Supply trucks shared the roads with tanks, artillery pieces, marching infantry, ambulances, and military police trying to direct everyone to their destinations. Every intersection was a bottleneck. Every town was a maze, and the roads themselves were falling apart under the constant pounding of heavy vehicles. Red's truck was fourth in the convoy, which meant he spent the entire first day eating dust from the vehicles ahead of him. The dust was so thick that he could barely see the road. It coated everything: his skin, his clothes, his lungs. He breathed it, tasted it, felt it grinding between his teeth. The dust got into the truck's engine compartment, mixing with oil and creating a gritty paste that accelerated wear on every moving part. It clogged air filters that were already working overtime in the summer heat. It covered the windshield in a film that the wipers could not fully clear, leaving streaks that distorted vision. Red found himself leaning forward in his seat, squinting through the dirty glass, trying to make out the road ahead. His back began to ache from the tension of holding that position hour after hour. The truck's suspension, designed for American roads, was overwhelmed by the rutted French highways. Every pothole sent a jarring shock through the frame and into Red's spine. His teeth rattled. His head bounced against the back of the seat. He learned to anticipate the worst bumps and brace himself, but there were too many to avoid them all. By the time they reached the first refueling stop, 6 hours into the drive, Red's eyes were red-rimmed and watering. His throat felt like sandpaper. His entire body ached from the constant vibration and jarring impacts. The other drivers looked the same: exhausted, filthy, but determined. They climbed out of their trucks moving like old men, joints stiff, muscles protesting. Some of them sat on the running boards for a moment, just trying to work out the cramps in their legs. Others immediately went to work checking their vehicles, looking for problems that needed to be fixed before they could continue. The refueling stop was organized chaos. Fuel trucks dispensed gasoline as fast as the pumps could flow. Mechanics moved from vehicle to vehicle, checking oil levels, tire pressure, brake fluid. There was a field kitchen set up, serving hot coffee and sandwiches, but most drivers didn't have time to eat. They grabbed coffee, maybe a sandwich to eat while driving, and got back on the road. The schedule allowed for a 30-minute refueling stop. Most drivers were back in their trucks within 20 minutes. There was no time for anything else. The Army needed supplies. Patton needed fuel. The war wouldn't wait for drivers to rest or clean up or complain about conditions. The second half of the first run was worse. By now, it was dark, and the convoy was driving without headlights. This was standard procedure in a combat zone. Headlights would make them targets for German aircraft or artillery. So they drove in near total darkness, following the truck ahead by watching for the faint glow of its taillights. But even those taillights were partially obscured, painted over to reduce their visibility from the air. What remained was a dull red glow, barely visible in the darkness that Red had to follow without getting too close or falling too far behind. The distance between trucks was critical. Too close, and you risked rear-ending the truck ahead if it stopped suddenly. Too far, and you risked losing sight of it entirely in the darkness, which could lead to getting separated from the convoy and lost. Red gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles ached. His eyes burned from staring into the darkness, trying to track that faint red glow while also watching for obstacles in the road. Every few miles, another hazard appeared in the darkness. A crater in the road left by an artillery shell, its edges crumbling and unstable. A burned-out vehicle that had been pushed to the side but still jutted into the roadway, its blackened frame a reminder of what happened when you weren't paying attention. A section of road that had turned to mud from a recent rainstorm, the surface slick and treacherous. A dead horse lying in the ditch, its bloated body filling the air with the smell of decay. French refugees walking along the roadside in the darkness, their faces pale and exhausted, carrying everything they owned in bundles and suitcases. He had to slow down for these obstacles, but not too much, because the trucks behind him needed to keep moving. If one truck stopped, the entire convoy stopped, and delays meant soldiers on the front line went without ammunition or fuel. So Red learned to navigate obstacles without stopping, steering around craters, threading the needle between wreckage and the edge of the road, maintaining speed even when every instinct told him to slow down and be cautious. It was terrifying at first, this blind driving in the darkness at speeds that felt suicidal given the conditions. But after a few hours, it became automatic. His hands and feet worked the controls without conscious thought. His eyes tracked the taillights ahead with mechanical precision. His mind entered a state somewhere between alertness and autopilot, processing information and reacting without the delay of conscious decision-making. This was survival mode, and Red would spend the next 83 days living in it. They reached the Chartres depot at 2 in the morning, 18 hours after they had started. Red was so tired that he almost crashed the truck while parking it in the unloading area. He sat in the cab for a long moment after shutting off the engine, just trying to convince his body to move. Everything hurt. His back, his legs, his arms, even his jaw from clenching his teeth for hours. A sergeant he didn't recognize appeared at the driver's side window and banged on the door. "Let's go, driver. Unload and get back on the road. You have a return run to make." Red wanted to ask if there would be time to sleep, time to eat a hot meal, time to do anything other than climb back into this truck and drive another 18 hours back to the beaches. But he already knew the answer. He climbed out of the cab, his legs shaky, and walked to the back of the truck. The unloading crews were already there, hauling out crates of artillery shells. They worked fast, practiced, efficient. Within 20 minutes, the truck was empty. Within 30 minutes, it was loaded again with empty fuel drums, damaged equipment, and 3 wounded soldiers who needed transport back to field hospitals near the coast. Red climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and got back in line with the convoy. He had been off the road for less than an hour. The return trip was a blur. Red drove on instinct and willpower, his mind shutting down everything except the basic functions needed to keep the truck on the road. He stopped seeing the scenery. He stopped thinking about anything beyond the next mile. He became a machine, turning the wheel, pressing the pedals, keeping his eyes open through sheer force of will. Twice he started to nod off and jerked awake only because the truck drifted toward the ditch. Once he actually fell asleep for a few seconds and woke up to find the truck veering into the oncoming lane. He yanked the wheel hard, overcorrected, and nearly rolled the truck before regaining control. His heart hammered in his chest. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool night air. That was close. Too close. If he had crashed, he would have killed himself, the wounded soldiers in the back, and possibly caused a pileup that would take hours to clear. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't fail. So he rolled down the window, letting the cold air blast his face, He started singing, loudly, every song he could remember from basic training, from church, from his childhood, anything to keep his brain active, anything to stay awake. He made it back to the beaches 36 hours after he had left. He had driven 400 miles, slept 0 hours, and eaten 3 K rations and a canteen of coffee. He was ordered to park the truck, perform basic maintenance, and stand by for the next convoy departure in 6 hours. 6 hours. That was all the rest he would get before doing it all over again. Red found a spot of grass near the truck park, rolled out his bedroll, and collapsed. He was asleep before his head hit the ground. He woke 5.5 hours later to someone shaking his shoulder. "Let's move, Sergeant. Convoy leaves in 30 minutes. Red sat up, his entire body protesting. Every muscle ached. His eyes felt full of sand. His head pounded with a headache that started at the base of his skull and wrapped around to his temples. But he stood up, rolled up his bedroll, and walked to the mess tent. He had 30 minutes. He could get coffee, use the latrine, and maybe splash some water on his face. Then it would be back in the truck for another loop. Another 400 miles. Another day and a half of driving on roads that were falling apart, in a truck that was barely holding together, with no sleep and no prospect of rest until the mission was over. And the mission wouldn't be over until Patton reached Germany, or until Red's truck broke down, or until Red himself broke down, whichever came first. The Red Ball Express was supposed to be a temporary solution. 3 weeks, maybe a month at most, until the ports were operational and a proper supply system could be established. But 3 weeks turned into 4. 4 turned into 6. And the demands kept increasing. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express was operating nearly 6,000 trucks. The convoys never stopped. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, an endless stream of trucks rolled from the beaches to forward depots and back again. The numbers were staggering. In the first 3 weeks alone, the Red Ball Express delivered over 89,000 tons of supplies. That works out to roughly 4,200 tons per day. To put that in perspective, a single Sherman tank weighs 30 tons. The Red Ball was delivering the equivalent of 140 Sherman tanks worth of supplies every single day, and they did it with trucks that were never designed for this kind of punishment. The standard 2.5-ton truck, the workhorse of the operation, was built for short hauls and moderate loads. Drive a few miles, unload, return to base, perform maintenance. That was the expected usage pattern. But Red Ball drivers were running these trucks at maximum capacity for hundreds of miles per day, often with loads that exceeded the weight limit. The trucks broke down constantly. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, axles snapped. Tires blew out so frequently that some trucks went through a complete set of 6 tires in a single round trip. The maintenance crews worked miracles. They would strip parts from trucks that were beyond repair and use them to keep other trucks running. They became experts at jury-rigged solutions. Need a new fan belt and don't have one? Cut up a tire and make one. Engine running rough because the fuel is contaminated? Drain the tank. Pour it through a makeshift filter made from a T-shirt stretched over a fuel can, and pour it back in. Brakes not working. Downshift early and use the engine to slow down, and pray you don't have to make any sudden stops. The drivers adapted. They learned to listen to their trucks, to recognize the sounds that meant something was about to fail. A new rattle in the engine. A vibration in the steering wheel. A subtle change in how the brakes felt. They learned to perform field repairs in the dark on the side of the road, with traffic rushing past them. They learned to push their trucks and themselves beyond any reasonable limit, and they learned to look out for each other. The Red Ball Express was not just a logistics operation. It became a brotherhood. When a driver broke down on the side of the road, other drivers would stop to help, even though it meant falling behind schedule. When a convoy got stuck in mud, drivers from other convoys would appear with chains and shovels and raw muscle to pull them out. When a driver fell asleep at the wheel and crashed, other drivers would make sure he was okay, help him get his truck back on the road if possible, and cover for him with the officers if necessary. They were all in this together. Black soldiers doing a job that white officers had said was impossible. Every mile driven, every ton delivered, every day the operation continued was proof that they could do the impossible. They took pride in that. They took strength from that, and they pushed themselves even harder because of that. Red Ball convoys passed through dozens of French towns and villages on their routes. The reactions from local French civilians were mixed, complicated, and revealing. Many French people had never seen black Americans before. France had colonial subjects from Africa, of course, but the social dynamics were completely different. When white American soldiers rolled through French towns, they were greeted as liberators. Children ran alongside the vehicles, cheering. Women threw flowers. Men offered wine. It was a celebration, a moment of pure joy as France was freed from Nazi occupation. When black Red Ball drivers rolled through those same towns, the reception was more subdued. Some French civilians, influenced by Nazi propaganda that portrayed black people as subhuman, avoided the convoys entirely. Others were curious but cautious, unsure how to interact with these soldiers. But there were also French people who saw past the racism, who recognized that these men were risking their lives to deliver the supplies that would liberate France. These people would wave, offer food and water, and thank the drivers in broken English. For Red and the other drivers, these moments of recognition meant everything. They were thousands of miles from home, driving trucks through a foreign country, doing a job that most people would never know about. But when a French farmer offered you a bottle of wine, or a French child waved an American flag as you drove past, it reminded you why you were here. You were fighting for freedom, not just for France, but for the idea that all people deserve freedom. It was an irony that was not lost on Red or any of the other black soldiers. They were fighting for freedom in Europe while their families back home in America lived under segregation, couldn't vote, couldn't attend the same schools, or eat at the same restaurants as white Americans. They wore the same uniform as white soldiers, took the same risks, did the same work, but were treated as second-class citizens by the very country they were serving. Some drivers became bitter about this. Others tried not to think about it, focusing on the mission at hand. Red fell somewhere in between. He understood the injustice. He felt the anger, but he also believed that by proving what black soldiers could do, by showing that they could accomplish missions that white officers said were impossible, he was fighting for a better future. Maybe, when the war ended and they all went home, America would have to acknowledge what black soldiers had contributed. Maybe things would change. It was a hope, nothing more, but hope was often the only thing that kept you going during the fourth straight day of driving with no real sleep. By late September, the Red Ball Express had been running for a month, and the cracks were starting to show. Not in the determination of the drivers, but in the physical toll the operation was taking. Red had lost weight. All the drivers had. There simply wasn't time to eat properly. You grabbed food when you could, wolfed it down in minutes, and got back on the road. K rations and cold coffee became the primary diet. K rations were survival food, not meant to be eaten for weeks on end. They came in 3 variations: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But they all tasted roughly the same. A bland, vaguely meat-flavored paste that provided calories and nutrients but no satisfaction. Red found himself fantasizing about the meals his mother used to cook: fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread warm from the oven. The memories were so vivid that he could almost taste them, and that made the K rations even harder to choke down. But hunger was manageable. The body adapted. After a few weeks, you stopped feeling constantly hungry and settled into a state of low-level starvation that became the new normal. Your stomach stopped growling. Your thoughts stopped drifting toward food. You just felt tired all the time. A bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Sleep deprivation was even worse than hunger. Red was averaging maybe 4 hours of sleep per day, and that was broken up into short naps rather than continuous rest. He would pull into the truck park after completing a run, collapse on the ground or in the cab of his truck, and fall asleep instantly. But the sleep was never deep, never restorative. He would wake up feeling just as tired as when he fell asleep, his body heavy and unresponsive, his mind foggy and slow. The medical effects of prolonged sleep deprivation were well documented, though not widely known to the drivers experiencing them. After a few days without proper sleep, cognitive function begins to decline. Reaction times slow. Decision-making becomes impaired. Memory suffers. After a week, the effects become more severe. mood swings, irritability, paranoia. After 2 weeks, hallucinations begin. Red started experiencing these hallucinations in the 3rd week of September, shadow figures at the edge of his vision that disappeared when he looked directly at them, phantom obstacles in the road that turned out to be nothing, voices calling his name when no one was there. Once, he was convinced that the truck ahead of him had stopped and he slammed on the brakes, only to realize seconds later that the truck was still moving and he had just hallucinated the brake lights glowing brighter. The truck behind him nearly rear-ended him. The driver, a corporal named Marcus Johnson, pulled alongside at the next stop and asked what happened. Red tried to explain, but the words came out wrong, jumbled and confused. Johnson just nodded, understanding written on his face. It happens to all of us, man. Just try to stay focused. But staying focused was becoming harder and harder. Red would find himself losing chunks of time. He would be driving through one town and then suddenly be miles past it with no memory of the intervening distance. He would be thinking about something and then realize he had been staring at the road for minutes without actually seeing it. His mind was shutting down, taking brief vacations from consciousness even while his body continued to function. Other drivers reported similar experiences. One man swore he had driven through a German checkpoint, handed papers to a Wehrmacht soldier, and continued on his way. When he mentioned this to other drivers, they looked at him like he was crazy. There were no German checkpoints on the Red Ball route. The Germans had been pushed back hundreds of miles. It had been a hallucination, a waking dream brought on by extreme exhaustion, but it had felt completely real to him. He could describe the German soldier in detail, the uniform, the expression on his face, the sound of his voice. Another driver reported seeing his dead brother sitting in the passenger seat of his truck. They had a conversation, the driver said, about family and home, and whether there would be fried chicken at the reunion when the war was over. The brother smiled and said there would be. Then he was gone, and the driver was alone in the cab again, tears streaming down his face. These stories circulated among the drivers, shared during refueling stops and brief moments of rest. No one mocked the men who reported them. Everyone understood that they were all operating at the edge of human endurance. The hallucinations, the lost time, the fog that had settled over their minds, these were just the cost of the mission. The medical officers attached to the Red Ball were deeply concerned. They were seeing cases of extreme fatigue, stress disorders, and physical breakdowns that normally took months of combat to develop. But these men weren't in combat. They were just driving trucks. Except it wasn't just driving trucks. It was driving under conditions that violated every principle of safe operation. It was working 18-hour shifts with minimal rest. It was operating heavy machinery while exhausted to the point of hallucination. It was dealing with constant mechanical failures, dangerous road conditions, and the psychological pressure of knowing that if you failed, soldiers on the front line would die because they didn't have ammunition or fuel. The stress was cumulative, building day by day until it manifested in physical and psychological symptoms that the doctors had no real treatment for. They could prescribe rest, but there was no rest to be had. They could recommend reducing the workload, but the workload was determined by military necessity, not medical best practices. All they could do was document the problems, send reports up the chain of command, and try to catch the men who were on the verge of complete breakdown before they killed themselves or others in accidents. The medical officers recommended that the operation be scaled back, that drivers be given mandatory rest periods of at least 8 hours between shifts, that safety protocols be implemented to reduce accidents. Their recommendations were noted and then ignored. The mission was too important. Patton was still advancing. The Third Army was tearing through German defenses, racing toward the border, pushing the Wehrmacht back toward their homeland. They were winning the war, and the Red Ball Express was making it possible. The drivers would just have to hold on a little longer, just a few more weeks, the officers said. Just until the ports are operational and the supply situation stabilizes. Then you can rest. Then you can recover. Just hold on a little longer. But a few more weeks turned into a month. And the month stretched toward 2. And the drivers kept driving, kept pushing themselves beyond what should have been possible, because the mission demanded it, and because stopping was not an option. Let me ask you something, And I really want you to think about this. Have you ever been in a situation where people doubted you not because of anything you did, but because of who you were? Maybe it was at work when you had a good idea but got passed over because you were too young, too new, or just not what they expected. Maybe it was in school when a teacher assumed you couldn't handle advanced classes because of where you came from. Maybe it was in your personal life when family or friends dismissed your dreams as unrealistic. You knew you could do it. You knew you had the skills, the determination, the intelligence. But no one would give you the chance to prove it because they had already decided what you were capable of based on their assumptions about you. The Red Ball Express drivers lived that reality every single day. White officers openly doubted their abilities. Some commanders tried to get the operation shut down because they didn't trust black soldiers with such a critical mission. There were proposals to replace the Red Ball drivers with white soldiers. Even though the white soldiers were needed for combat roles, and even though the Red Ball drivers were proving every day that they could do the job. These men were told, sometimes to their faces, sometimes through policy decisions, that they weren't good enough, that they couldn't be trusted with combat roles, that their only value was in support positions. And they responded by doing the impossible. If you've ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or judged based on who you are rather than what you can do, I want you to go down to the comments right now and write this exact phrase. I had the potential, but nobody saw it. That's it. Just that one sentence. Because here's the thing. When you write that, you're creating a record. You're acknowledging that you were underestimated. But more importantly, you're part of a community of people who know exactly what that feels like. And maybe seeing all these comments will remind someone reading this that potential isn't always obvious, that the people we underestimate often turn out to be the ones who achieve the impossible. So, go ahead. Comment right now. I had the potential, but nobody saw it. Let's build a thread of voices that refuse to accept other people's limitations. Because the Red Ball Express proves that when you give people a chance, when you let them prove what they can do instead of deciding in advance what they can't do, incredible things happen. And your story, your potential, deserves to be recognized, too. October 1944. 6 weeks into the Red Ball Express operation. Red was driving his truck through a small French town whose name he didn't know and wouldn't remember. It was raining. A cold, steady rain that turned the dirt roads to mud and made visibility almost zero. The convoy had slowed to a crawl. Red could barely see the truck ahead of him through the sheets of rain. And then he heard the sound. A sharp crack, followed by a grinding screech from somewhere deep in the truck's engine. Red had heard that sound before. It meant something critical had broken. He tried to downshift, hoping to baby the truck to the next town where mechanics might be able to fix it. But the engine seized completely. One moment it was running, rough but running. The next moment it was dead, the truck coasting to a stop in the middle of the road. Red sat in the cab, rain hammering on the roof, and felt a wave of despair wash over him. This truck had carried him through 6 weeks of the hardest driving he had ever done. He had repaired it 12 times. He had coaxed it through mechanical problems that should have been terminal. He had learned its every sound, every vibration, every quirk, and now it was dead. The convoy kept moving, flowing around Red's stopped truck. Other drivers honked or shouted encouragement as they passed. "You'll get it running, Red. See you at the depot." But Red knew this was different. This wasn't a blown tire or a broken fan belt. This was catastrophic engine failure. The truck wasn't going to start again without a complete engine rebuild, which could take days or weeks. Red climbed out of the cab into the rain. He needed to get the truck off the road before it caused a traffic jam or an accident. He got back in, released the brake, and tried to steer it toward the shoulder using the truck's momentum. It rolled about 10 feet and then stopped, still partially blocking the road. That was when Red noticed the children. 3 French kids, maybe 10 or 12 years old, standing under an awning across the street, watching him. They were soaked. Probably had been watching the convoy pass through town for a while. Red waved at them, trying to signal that he needed help pushing the truck, but they just stared. Then one of the children, a girl, started walking toward him. She was small, skinny, wearing a coat that was too big for her. She reached the truck and looked up at Red. Her face was serious, adult in a way that children's faces shouldn't be. "You are American," she said in heavily accented English. "Yes," Red replied. "My truck broke down. I need to push it off the road." She nodded. Then she turned and called out to the other children. They came running, and so did several adults who had been watching from doorways. Within minutes, Red had a dozen French civilians helping him push the truck to the side of the road. They didn't speak much English. Red didn't speak any French, but they worked together, putting their shoulders against the truck, straining against the weight. The truck moved, inch by inch, until it was clear of the road. The girl who had first approached him looked at Red again. "You bring supplies for the army?" "Yes." "To fight the Germans?" "Yes." She nodded solemnly. "Thank you." And then she and the others went back to their doorways, their awnings, their dry places. Red stood in the rain, watching them go, and felt something shift inside him. These people got it. They understood what the Red Ball Express was doing. They understood that every truck that passed through their town was helping to liberate their country. The recognition, the gratitude, even from a child standing in the rain, made the exhaustion and the frustration in the broken-down truck a little more bearable. Red spent 3 days in that French town waiting for a replacement truck. The maintenance crew told him it would be faster to bring in a new truck than to repair the old one. So Red waited, ate hot meals prepared by French families, slept in an actual bed for the first time in weeks, and tried not to think about the fact that he was falling behind schedule. On the 3rd day, a new truck arrived. Actually, new was a generous description. It was a refurbished truck that had been patched together from parts of other broken-down vehicles, and Red was back on the road. But the truck he had driven for 6 weeks was left behind, pushed to a field at the edge of a town where dozens of other dead vehicles sat rusting in the French countryside. That field was a graveyard of the Red Ball Express. Trucks that had driven thousands of miles and given everything they had until they simply couldn't give any more. Red thought about those trucks sometimes when he was driving. They were machines, lifeless metal and rubber and glass. But they had served. They had completed missions that nobody thought they could complete. And when they finally broke down for the last time, they were abandoned because there was no time to mourn a machine, no matter how faithful it had been. The drivers were the same. If you broke down, if exhaustion or injury or illness finally caught up to you, you were pulled from the line and sent to a rear area hospital. Someone else took your truck. The convoy kept moving. The mission continued. You were thanked for your service and then replaced, because the mission was always bigger than any individual driver, any individual truck, any individual sacrifice. It was a harsh reality, but it was also the nature of war. Logistics was about numbers. Tons delivered per day, miles driven per hour, trucks operational versus trucks down for maintenance, casualties versus replacements. You could be the best driver in the convoy, the most dedicated, the most skilled. But if your truck broke down, or if you broke down, the only thing that mattered was how quickly you could be replaced so the numbers didn't drop. Red understood this. It didn't make it any easier to accept, but he understood it. So he climbed into his new truck, adjusted the seat, tested the pedals and the steering, and got back in line with the convoy. 400 miles to the depot and back, 18 hours of driving, 6 hours of rest. And then do it all over again. That was the job. That was what the mission required. That was what he had volunteered for. By November 1944, the situation had changed. The ports were operational. Antwerp, the largest port in Europe, had been captured and cleared of German forces. Supply ships were arriving daily. The traditional supply lines were being established. Rail lines were being repaired. Warehouses were being built. The logistics situation was stabilizing. The Red Ball Express was no longer critical. It was still useful, still delivering tons of supplies every day, but it was no longer the only thing keeping the Allied advance moving. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express was officially shut down. The final convoy ran from the beaches to the forward depots, delivered its cargo, and returned to base. The trucks were dispersed to other units. The drivers were reassigned. The operation that had kept the Allied armies supplied for 83 days simply ceased to exist. There was no ceremony, no parade, no formal recognition of what these men had accomplished. just orders to report to new assignments. Red and his unit were transferred to a transportation battalion supporting the buildup for the final push into Germany. It was similar work, driving trucks and delivering supplies, but at a slower pace, with more rest, under more normal conditions. It should have been a relief. After months of the brutal Red Ball schedule, returning to regular operations should have felt like a vacation. But Red felt hollow. The Red Ball Express had been hell, no question about it, but it had also been the most important thing he had ever done. It had been proof, undeniable proof, that black soldiers could perform at the highest level when given the opportunity. It had been a mission that everyone said was impossible, and they had made it possible through sheer determination and skill. Now it was over. And what did they have to show for it? No medals, no recognition, no change in how black soldiers were treated. They were still in segregated units, still given the worst assignments, still denied the opportunity to serve in combat roles. It was as if the Red Ball Express had never happened, as if 6,000 men had not driven hundreds of thousands of miles under impossible conditions, as if they had not delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies that made the liberation of France possible. The official army reports mentioned the Red Ball Express in passing, a successful logistics operation that demonstrated the importance of flexible supply systems. That was it. No mention of who had actually done the driving. No acknowledgement of the conditions they had worked under. No recognition of the fact that these were segregated units, proving they were equal to any other soldiers in the army. Red tried not to be bitter about it. He had done his job. He had contributed to winning the war. That should be enough, but it wasn't, because he knew that when the war ended and they all went home, nothing would change. The white soldiers would be celebrated as heroes. Black soldiers would be expected to go back to being second-class citizens. All the sacrifice, all the proof of their abilities would be forgotten or ignored. It was the reality of being a black soldier in 1944. You could be essential to victory. You could accomplish the impossible, but you would never be treated as equal. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The celebrations were enormous. In Paris, in London, in New York, in every city and town in the Allied nations, people poured into the streets to celebrate. The nightmare was over. Red was in Germany when the announcement came. His unit had spent the final months of the war delivering supplies to occupation forces. When the word came down that Germany had surrendered, the white soldiers in the area went wild. They cheered, they cried, they got drunk, they fired their weapons into the air in celebration. The black soldiers celebrated too, but more quietly. They were happy the war was over. They were relieved they had survived. But they also knew what was coming next. They were going home to an America that had not changed while they were gone. Red thought about the Red Ball Express as he packed his gear and prepared for the journey home. He thought about the roads through France, the endless convoys, the trucks that kept moving no matter what. He thought about the French civilians who had thanked him, the children who had helped push his truck, the medics who had patched him up when he crashed from exhaustion. He thought about the other drivers, the men who had become brothers during those 83 days. Some of them hadn't made it home. There had been accidents, some fatal. There had been illnesses. There had been men who broke down mentally and had to be sent to hospitals. The Red Ball had taken a toll on everyone who served in it. But they had done it. They had accomplished a mission that military experts said was impossible. They had proven that black soldiers were capable of anything white soldiers could do. They had demonstrated courage, skill, determination, and sacrifice. And Red hoped that someday someone would remember that. Someday the story of the Red Ball Express would be told. Someday people would know what these men had accomplished. It wouldn't be soon, probably not in his lifetime, but someday. Red Williams returned to Birmingham, Alabama in September 1945. He was 24 years old. He had an honorable discharge, a few service medals that didn't mean much, and memories of driving through France while the war raged around him. The journey home had taken weeks. First, a troop ship from France back to England, then another ship across the Atlantic to New York, a voyage that took 10 days. Then a train from New York to Alabama, sitting in a segregated car despite the fact that he had just spent 2 years serving his country overseas. When the train crossed into Alabama, Red felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name: relief to be home, anxiety about what came next, anger that he was returning to a country that still treated him as a second-class citizen despite everything he had done. He went back to his old job, working at a garage that serviced cars and trucks. The owner, an older white man named Mr. Patterson, who had known Red since he was a teenager, welcomed him back. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a handshake and an offer to start on Monday. Mr. Patterson asked about the war, and Red gave him the sanitized version. Drove trucks in France, delivered supplies, saw some action but nothing too serious. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. How could you explain the Red Ball Express to someone who hadn't been there? How could you make them understand what it meant to drive for 18 hours straight, to hallucinate from exhaustion, to watch your truck fall apart piece by piece and still keep it running through sheer will? Red didn't try. He just said it was tough, but he got through it, and Mr. Patterson nodded and said that was good, real good, and that was the end of the conversation. Red settled back into civilian life. He married Dorothy, his girlfriend who had waited for him throughout the war. They had known each other since high school, had been dating for 2 years before he was drafted. Dorothy had written him letters every week while he was overseas. Long letters full of news from home, gossip about people they knew, plans for the future. Red had read those letters during his brief rest periods, sometimes multiple times, using them as an anchor to remember that there was a life waiting for him beyond the endless convoys and French roads. The wedding was small, held at the church where Red's family had worshipped for 3 generations. Dorothy wore a simple white dress. Red wore his uniform, not because he was particularly proud of it, but because it was the best outfit he owned. The reception was held in the church basement, with food prepared by family members and music provided by a cousin who played guitar. It was a joyful day, but Red felt disconnected from it, as if he was watching the celebration from a distance rather than participating in it. This feeling of disconnection would persist for months. Red would be sitting at dinner with Dorothy and suddenly realize he had lost track of the conversation. He would be working on a car at the garage and find himself staring at the engine, his mind thousands of miles away, back on the roads of France. He would wake up in the middle of the night convinced he was late for a convoy departure, his heart racing, sweat soaking the sheets. Dorothy was patient with him. She had heard stories about veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life. She knew that Red had been through things he couldn't or wouldn't talk about. So she gave him space, didn't push him to open up before he was ready, and tried to create a home environment where he felt safe and supported. Gradually, over months, Red began to come back to himself. The nightmares became less frequent. The moments of disconnection grew shorter. He started to feel present in his own life again, to engage with the world around him rather than being trapped in memories of the war. But he never forgot the Red Ball Express. He kept a photograph from the war, a blurry shot of his convoy on a French road that someone had taken and copies had been distributed to the drivers. He kept it in a drawer, didn't display it, but he would take it out sometimes when he was alone and look at it, remembering. Red and Dorothy had children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, born over the course of 10 years. Red worked hard to provide for them, took on extra shifts at the garage, saved money carefully. He bought a house, a modest 3-bedroom in a black neighborhood on the edge of Birmingham. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and that mattered. He became a deacon at his church, helping with services and community outreach programs. He coached Little League baseball, teaching neighborhood kids how to hit and field and work together as a team. He lived a good life, a quiet life, the kind of life that doesn't make history books but is valuable and meaningful nonetheless. When his children asked him about the war, Red would tell them about the Red Ball Express. He would explain how thousands of black soldiers had kept the Allied armies supplied during the most critical phase of the war in Europe. He would tell them about the trucks that drove day and night, about the roads through France, about the mission that everyone said was impossible. His children would listen, impressed by their father's service, proud of what he had accomplished, but Red could tell they didn't fully understand. How could they? They had grown up in a different world. A world where the war was something that happened a long time ago, something you learned about in school but couldn't really comprehend. They had never experienced segregation the way Red had, never been told directly that they were inferior because of their skin color. The civil rights movement had begun to change things, slowly, painfully slowly, but change was happening. By the time Red's youngest daughter entered high school in 1968, schools in Birmingham were integrated. Restaurants served black and white customers at the same tables. The most overt forms of discrimination were illegal, though prejudice and inequality persisted in subtler forms. His children didn't understand what it meant to be a black soldier in a segregated army. They didn't understand the humiliation of being told you weren't good enough for combat, of being assigned to support roles not because of your abilities, but because of your race. They didn't understand the pride of proving everyone wrong, of accomplishing a mission that white officers said was impossible. How could they? They had grown up in a world where their father was a respected member of the community, a deacon at church, a business owner who eventually bought the garage where he had worked for 20 years. They saw him as successful, as proof that hard work and dedication led to achievement. They didn't see the barriers he had overcome, the prejudice he had faced, the countless times he had been underestimated or dismissed because of his race. And Red didn't burden them with those stories. He wanted his children to grow up confident, to believe they could achieve anything they set their minds to. He didn't want them to be weighed down by the history of discrimination and struggle that had shaped his own life. So he told them the heroic parts of the Red Ball Express story, the accomplishments and the pride, and he left out the pain and anger and frustration that had accompanied those accomplishments. In the decades after the war, military historians slowly began to recognize the significance of the Red Ball Express. Books were written, each one adding a few more details to the historical record. Documentaries were made, though they tended to focus on the logistics and strategy rather than the human stories of the drivers. Museums created exhibits showing the trucks and telling the stories of the operation, though these exhibits were often small, tucked away in corners, easily overlooked by visitors more interested in displays about combat operations and famous battles. But even this recognition was incomplete. The focus was always on the logistics, on the tons delivered and the miles driven, on the innovation and improvisation that made the operation possible. The human cost, the exhaustion and sacrifice of the drivers, was mentioned but never fully explored. And the racial aspect, the fact that this was an operation carried out almost entirely by segregated black units proving themselves in a system that considered them inferior, was often downplayed or omitted entirely. Red found this frustrating. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a logistics operation. It was proof that segregation was wrong. It was proof that black soldiers could do anything they were given the opportunity to do. It was proof that racism was based on lies and ignorance, not on any actual difference in ability or character. But America in the 1950s and 1960s wasn't ready to hear that message. Segregation was still the law in much of the country. Black veterans who had fought for freedom in Europe came home to a nation that denied them basic civil rights. They couldn't vote in many southern states. They couldn't eat at the same restaurants as white people. They couldn't attend the same schools. They were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to have served, to accept their second-class status with quiet dignity. Red watched the civil rights movement develop in the 1960s with a complicated mix of hope and fear and pride. He attended marches, walking alongside people half his age who were demanding the rights that should have been theirs from birth. He registered voters, helping elderly black citizens navigate the deliberately confusing and intimidating process of getting on the voting rolls. He used his status as a veteran to push for change in his community, arguing that men who had served their country deserved to be treated as full citizens. And he always pointed to the Red Ball Express as evidence that black Americans deserved equality. "We drove those trucks," he would say at community meetings, at voter registration drives, at protests outside segregated businesses. "We kept the Army supplied when white officers said it couldn't be done. We worked 18 hours a day, drove through the night, pushed ourselves beyond exhaustion because the mission mattered. We helped win the war. We proved we were equal to any soldier in any army. And we did it while being told we weren't good enough, while serving in a segregated military, while fighting for freedom abroad that was denied to us at home. If that's not proof that segregation is wrong, if that's not proof that we deserve equal rights, I don't know what is." Sometimes people listened. Sometimes they were moved by his words, by the quiet dignity and conviction with which he spoke. Sometimes change happened, small victories that accumulated over time into real progress. But more often, his words fell on deaf ears or hostile hearts. People who benefited from the status quo didn't want to hear about black veterans who had proven themselves. They didn't want to acknowledge the contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home. They didn't want their comfortable assumptions challenged by inconvenient truths. Red kept fighting anyway, because what else could he do? He had not driven through France for 83 days, had not pushed himself to the edge of human endurance, had not helped accomplish the impossible, only to come home and accept inequality. The Red Ball Express had taught him that impossible was just a word people used when they didn't want to try. If 6,000 men in broken-down trucks could keep an entire army supplied across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, then surely America could find a way to treat all its citizens equally. Red Williams died in 1998 at the age of 77. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he had served in World War II as a truck driver. It didn't mention the Red Ball Express. His funeral was attended by family, friends, members of his church, and a few fellow veterans who remembered him from the war. No military officials attended. There was no honor guard. Red had requested a simple service, and that was what he got. But at the funeral, one of his sons gave a eulogy that focused on Red's service in the Red Ball Express. He described the operation in detail, explaining what his father had accomplished during those 83 days in 1944. He talked about the impossible conditions, the exhaustion, the determination. He talked about what it meant to be a black soldier proving yourself in a segregated army. And he ended with a question. What would have happened if the Red Ball Express had failed? If those drivers had not been able to deliver the supplies Patton needed, if the trucks had broken down, if the drivers had collapsed, if the operation had been shut down? The answer is that the war would have lasted longer. More soldiers would have died. The liberation of Europe would have been delayed. The outcome might have been the same eventually, but the cost would have been higher. The Red Ball Express mattered, and the men who drove those trucks mattered. They deserved to be remembered not just as drivers, not just as logistics personnel, but as soldiers who accomplished a mission that changed the course of the war. After the funeral, several of Red's fellow veterans gathered to share memories. They talked about the roads through France, the endless convoys, the trucks that never stopped moving, the determination to prove what black soldiers could do. One man, a former sergeant named William Johnson who had driven in Red's convoy, said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. The Red Ball Express wasn't about trucks, he said. It was about respect. Every mile we drove, every ton we delivered, every day we kept that operation running, we were demanding respect. We were saying, you can segregate us. You can discriminate against us. You can deny us opportunities, but you cannot deny what we are capable of. We will prove it to you, whether you want to see it or not. And we did prove it. We drove the impossible route under impossible conditions, and we succeeded. That was our victory, not defeating the Germans. That was everyone's victory. Our victory was proving that we were equal to any soldier in any army. That was what the Red Ball Express was really about. Before we continue to the final reflections on this incredible story, I want to share something with you. If you are someone who has always been drawn to the untold stories of World War II, the missions that slipped through the cracks of mainstream history books, the ordinary people who achieved extraordinary things when everything was on the line, then this channel was created for you. We don't just retell famous battles or celebrate glory. We dig deeper into the archives. We find the mechanics, the drivers, the support personnel, the forgotten innovators who changed the course of history without ever becoming famous. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered. The ones that show you what real dedication looks like when there are no cameras, no immediate recognition, just a mission that needs to be completed and people brave enough to see it through. If that resonates with you, I want to ask you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button. Not because I need the numbers, although I appreciate every subscriber, but because every time you subscribe, you are telling me that these stories matter to you, that the drivers of the Red Ball Express, The 6,000 men who kept an entire army supplied deserve to be known and honored. That innovation, courage, and sacrifice in the face of discrimination and impossible odds deserves a place in your feed and in history. We upload deep investigations like this one every single week. Stories that will make you see World War II in ways you never imagined. Stories that reveal the human side of war, the complexity of heroism, and the truth about who really wins wars. So, subscribe right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And become part of a community that refuses to let these incredible people and their accomplishments be forgotten by history. Now let us return to the Red Ball Express and understand what this operation teaches us about war, logistics, and the power of determination. Today, the Red Ball Express is recognized, somewhat belatedly, as one of the most significant logistics operations in military history. Military academies study it as an example of improvisation under pressure. Logistics officers analyze it to understand how supply chains can be pushed beyond their theoretical limits. Historians examine it as evidence of the capabilities and contributions of black soldiers during World War II. Several museums have exhibits dedicated to the Red Ball Express. The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture includes a section on black soldiers in World War II, with the Red Ball featured prominently. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has a restored 2.5-ton truck painted with the Red Ball symbol. Veterans groups have worked to ensure that the story is told in schools and documentaries. But the recognition is incomplete. Ask 100 Americans what the Red Ball Express was, and most will have never heard of it. Ask them to name important battles or operations from World War II, and they will mention D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, the bombing of Hiroshima. All important events, all worthy of remembering. But the Red Ball Express, which made many of those victories possible, remains largely unknown outside of military and historical circles. This is partly because logistics is not dramatic. A convoy of trucks driving through France does not have the visual impact of Marines storming a beach or paratroopers dropping into enemy territory. It is easier to make movies about combat than about supply operations. It is easier to celebrate the soldiers who pull triggers than the soldiers who deliver the bullets. But it is also because of racism, both historical and ongoing. The Red Ball Express was an operation carried out by segregated black units at a time when the military and the nation as a whole considered black Americans to be inferior. After the war, there was little interest in highlighting the contributions of black soldiers. White veterans were celebrated and honored. Black veterans were expected to return to their pre-war status as second-class citizens. The accomplishments of the Red Ball Express were minimized or ignored because acknowledging them would undermine the justifications for segregation. If black soldiers could accomplish missions that white officers said were impossible, if they could perform at the same level as white soldiers when given the opportunity, then what was the justification for treating them as inferior? The answer, of course, is that there was no justification. Segregation was based on prejudice and racism, not on any actual difference in capability. The Red Ball Express proved this beyond any doubt, but acknowledging that proof would have required admitting that segregation was wrong, and America in the 1940s and 1950s was not ready to do that. So the story was buried, minimized, treated as a footnote rather than a central element of the World War II narrative. What lessons can we draw from the Red Ball Express? First, that wars are won by logistics as much as by combat. Patton's Third Army could not have advanced across France without fuel, ammunition, and supplies. The Red Ball Express delivered those supplies under impossible conditions, and in doing so, they enabled one of the most successful military campaigns of the war. Generals and strategists often focus on tactics and strategy, but logistics is the foundation that makes tactics and strategy possible. Second, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when given the opportunity and the motivation. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were not elite soldiers. They were not specially trained. Many of them had been mechanics, truck drivers, and laborers before the war. But when they were given a critical mission and told that the success of the war effort depended on them, they rose to the challenge. They worked beyond exhaustion. They kept broken-down trucks running through improvisation and sheer determination. They proved that ability is not determined by rank or credentials, but by dedication and will. Third, that discrimination and segregation waste human potential. The men of the Red Ball Express were capable of serving in combat roles. Many of them wanted to serve in combat roles, but they were denied that opportunity because of racism. Instead, they were assigned to transportation and supply, roles that were considered less important. And yet, when those roles became critical to the war effort, when the entire success of the European campaign depended on keeping the supply lines open, these supposedly inferior soldiers accomplished what everyone said was impossible. How many other black soldiers could have contributed in other ways if they had been given the chance? How many white soldiers died because the Army refused to use black soldiers in combat roles where they could have made a difference? Segregation did not just harm black Americans. It harmed the entire war effort by wasting the talents and abilities of hundreds of thousands of men who were willing and able to serve. Fourth, that recognition matters. The men of the Red Ball Express did their job without expectation of glory or reward. They were motivated by duty, by the mission, by the desire to prove themselves. But the lack of recognition after the war was a betrayal. These men had kept the Allied armies supplied during the most critical phase of the war. They had worked under conditions that broke trucks and men alike. They had accomplished a logistics miracle, and they received almost no acknowledgement for it. No medals, no parades, no place in the history books. This sends a message, intentional or not, that their contributions did not matter, that they were interchangeable cogs in a machine rather than individuals who made choices, took risks, and succeeded against incredible odds. Recognition is not about ego. It is about justice. It is about ensuring that the people who contribute to important achievements are acknowledged and honored. The drivers of the Red Ball Express earned that recognition. They deserved it in 1945, and they deserve it now. The Red Ball Express operated for 83 days. In that time, it delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies. That is not an estimate or an approximation. The Army kept detailed records of tonnage delivered, 412,000 tons, transported by 6,000 trucks, driven by 6,000 men, across roads that were falling apart, in vehicles that were pushed far beyond their design limits. To put that number in perspective, it would take roughly 20 modern cargo ships to carry that much weight. The Red Ball Express did it with trucks driving 200 miles each way, day and night, for nearly 3 months. The cost was high. Hundreds of trucks were destroyed, pushed until they literally fell apart. Dozens of drivers were killed in accidents, crashes caused by exhaustion, mechanical failures, or simply the hazards of driving in a war zone. Hundreds more were injured, some permanently. Almost every driver who served in the Red Ball Express suffered from chronic health problems for the rest of their lives. Back injuries from hours in poorly designed seats, vision problems from driving in darkness and dust, respiratory problems from breathing exhaust fumes and road dust for months, post-traumatic stress from the constant pressure, the exhaustion, the accidents they witnessed or were involved in. The Army did not track these long-term costs. There were no follow-up studies on the health of Red Ball veterans, no programs to help them deal with the physical and psychological toll of the operation. They completed their mission, were reassigned, and were expected to move on as if nothing unusual had happened. But something unusual had happened. These men had been pushed beyond normal human limits. They had worked under conditions that would be considered inhumane by any modern standard. They had been asked to sacrifice their health, their safety, and in some cases their lives, to keep the supply lines open. And they had done it. Not because they were forced to, although orders were orders, not because they had no choice, although refusing would have meant court-martial. They did it because they believed in the mission, because they wanted to prove what black soldiers could do, because they understood that this was their chance to demonstrate that they were equal to any soldier in any army. The Red Ball Express was a triumph of logistics, but it was also a testament to the human spirit, to the capacity of people to endure incredible hardship when they believe their work matters. And it was the indictment of a system that forced men to prove their worth through suffering, that demanded superhuman effort from people who were denied basic human rights. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is complicated. On one hand, it demonstrated conclusively that black soldiers were capable of performing at the highest levels. It provided ammunition for the arguments that led to the desegregation of the military in 1948, just 3 years after the war ended. President Truman's executive order integrating the armed forces cited the performance of black soldiers in World War II as evidence that segregation was militarily inefficient and morally wrong. The Red Ball Express was one of the examples used to support this argument. On the other hand, the fact that black soldiers had to prove themselves through such extreme efforts, had to work under impossible conditions, and succeed at impossible tasks just to be considered equal, reveals the depth of racism in American society. White soldiers were assumed to be capable until they proved otherwise. Black soldiers were assumed to be incapable unless they proved otherwise, and the standard of proof was set impossibly high. Even after the military was desegregated, even after black soldiers had proven themselves in World War II, in Korea, in Vietnam, and in every subsequent conflict, they still faced discrimination and prejudice. The Red Ball Express did not end racism. It did not create equality. It simply provided one more piece of evidence, one more example, one more story that had to be told and retold until finally, grudgingly, America began to acknowledge that black Americans deserved the same rights and opportunities as white Americans. The drivers of the Red Ball Express did not see themselves as civil rights pioneers. They were soldiers doing their job, but their work became part of the larger struggle for equality, whether they intended it to or not. Every mile they drove, every ton they delivered, every day they kept the operation running. Despite exhaustion and discrimination and broken-down trucks, they were proving that the assumptions underlying segregation were lies. Some of them understood this at the time. Others did not realize it until years later, when they saw how their service in the Red Ball Express was being used to argue for civil rights and equality. But all of them, every single driver who served in that operation, contributed to changing America, not as quickly as they deserved, not as completely as they hoped, but they contributed, and that contribution should never be forgotten. The story of the Red Ball Express is ultimately a story about human potential, about what people can accomplish when they are given a mission, resources, and the freedom to prove themselves. It is a story about innovation under pressure, about solving impossible problems with limited tools. It is a story about brotherhood, about men from different backgrounds coming together to accomplish something larger than themselves. It is a story about sacrifice, about giving everything you have to a mission because you believe it matters. It is a story about injustice, about a system that forced men to prove their worth through suffering. It is a story about recognition, or the lack thereof, and what that says about who we choose to honor and remember. Most of all, it is a story that should be told, not just in history books and museums, but in schools, in documentaries, in conversations about what makes heroism and what we owe to those who serve. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were not perfect. They were ordinary men, with flaws and fears and doubts. But when they were asked to do something extraordinary, they rose to the challenge. They kept the trucks moving when every mechanical system said stop. They kept driving when exhaustion said rest. They kept the Allied armies supplied when everyone said it could not be done. That is heroism. Not the dramatic heroism of charging a machine gun nest or storming a beach, but the quiet heroism of doing your job day after day under impossible conditions because you believe it matters. The heroism of proving yourself when others doubt you. The heroism of accomplishing missions that history barely remembers. Sergeant James Red Williams and the 5,999 other men who drove for the Red Ball Express deserve to be remembered. Not just as statistics, not just as truck drivers, but as individuals who made choices, took risks, and succeeded when success seemed impossible. They deserve to have their story told. They deserve to be honored. They deserve to be part of the World War II narrative, not as a footnote, but as central players in one of the most important campaigns of the war. This is their story, the story of the Red Ball Express. The story of 6,000 men who proved that wars are won not just by the soldiers who fire guns, but by the men who deliver the bullets. The story of an operation that kept an army moving, a campaign advancing, and a war progressing toward victory. The story of determination, sacrifice, innovation, and the unbreakable human spirit. Remember their names. Remember their sacrifice. Remember the red ball painted on signs across France, marking the route of a convoy that never stopped moving. Remember what they accomplished. And remember that potential, true potential, is often found in the people we least expect, doing jobs we barely notice, accomplishing missions that change the world.